Hey there, folks. Jules Polanetsky, CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum. Many of you are getting an alert from your iPhone telling you that you can now upgrade to iOS 10. Apple released the new model of its phones, and it's had the beta software for the new operating system out for a little while. We've been playing with it, and now many of you are getting a notification telling you to upgrade. Some new privacy stuff. Let's talk about one that we've written about, the new controls you have over tracking, one that I think bears a little bit of understanding to understand what Apple has changed. It's also one that is generating some debate in the ad tech industry because of some of the changes it makes to the way companies can track you, and it may be useful for us to comment on that as well. Okay, first of all, there has been for quite some time an option on your phone called limit ad tracking. How do you get to it? You go to your settings, you go to privacy, and then under privacy, you can scroll down and you see an option for advertising. I'm going there now. Here is privacy. Scroll down, advertising, and it says limit ad tracking. Now, this is not new. What this has done until today is it resets the advertising identifier you have. It resets it. Now, you'll note there's actually a choice called reset advertising identifier. If you just want to reset the IDFA, the ad ID, this is like a cookie for apps. App operating systems don't support cookies, and so if apps want to work with third parties to do analytics or to track you, they need to give them some sort of identifier so as to be able to recognize you. So Apple provides one, and you've always had an option to reset it, and then you had an option to limit ad tracking. What did that do? What that did do is it reset the ad identifier. People aren't always aware of that. And it started sending a flag, and apps sign an agreement when they submit to the App Store or they use Apple's developer kits that they're going to follow Apple's rules. And the rule has been that when a consumer has set that flag, you were supposed to not track the user for things like behavioral advertising to provide them with relevant ads. You could still track. Now, why would an advertiser want to track if they weren't targeting you with ads? Well, people forget. Tracking is certainly sometimes about ad targeting, but very often it's about understanding how the advertising that companies are placing, like, hey, check this new app, hey, click on this thing, is it working at bringing you to then download an app, right? That's how apps get noticed, they advertise, and then hopefully you download them. So to understand which ads on which different services are successful, companies were measuring their advertising. So up until iOS 10, limit ad tracking meant please don't do any behavioral advertising, but yes, you can continue measuring whether your ads elsewhere are working effectively. Okay? We don't know the reason, but it could be that Apple decided that, well, maybe some companies were not cooperating and were continuing to track you, even though this limit ad tracking flag was on. It was just a request. Apps were supposed to comply with it, but maybe some of them weren't. Others may have been complying with it, but only perhaps for behavioral advertising, and they still might have been doing other robust things like using it as an ID that linked to other appended data, purchases you made offline, a whole set of different activities. So whatever the goal or whatever the motivation, Apple has decided that when people say limit ad tracking, no longer will that advertising identifier be sent to the app and to those third parties. And so now you won't get those behavioral ads, you won't get those other robust uses that might have been linked to that ID, but that also will interfere to some degree with companies that were using that to measure the advertising. Well, what's the real effect? Certainly people who said don't track probably didn't want to be tracked in any way, shape, or form. So probably truer to the consumer value. That might have been Apple's main motivation. Maybe it was to technically enforce the rules instead of relying on companies agreeing. Now that ID is no longer sent, and so Apple is able to say to users, hey, this actually does what it says. About 17%, according to our friends at Tune, a company that does mobile app analytics and has visibility into this, about 17% of users were actually finding that setting and using it. And so that's been an impact that has been there until today, but only for ad targeting. Companies were still able to do the basic tracking, so some of those, in theory, are going to lose some of the ability to measure and know whether the ads that they deliver are actually effective. So those folks aren't that happy about this change. Many companies simply stopped a lot of tracking generally, and once they saw that limit ad tracking. So for those, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Toon, in a study that I think is quite interesting, shows us that many more people were actually using this limit ad tracking feature, and it started trailing off down to 17%. And we don't know why, but a very good possibility is that some of the people who were using this feature, instead of finding this feature, now that actual ad blocking is feasible, maybe some of those people are actually using ad blocking, therefore eliminating tracking, but also eliminating advertising. And so perhaps this feature actually being effective in the big scheme of things gives people a better tool if what they really care about is tracking than something like ad blocking, where the advertisers not only lose tracking, but also lose the ability to deliver an ad. So that's at least another thing to balance in this conversation. For those of you in the world of privacy and the big picture goals, let me put out important long-term thing. It's very hard to think beyond the, hey, what does this really do today for ad tech? What does it do for consumers? But I think it's important to look at the much bigger picture. And here's the much bigger picture. Is this identifier personal information? Right? Much of industry has said, hey, it's not my name, it's not an email, it's anonymous. Computer scientists, regulators in Canada and Europe, and increasingly the Federal Trade Commission have said that an identifier that can identify your device is, in most cases, personal information. Not in all cases, but in most cases. And certainly if we're worried about the idea that this identifier could be linked to your identity in the hands of many, many third parties, and therefore can identify your device, certainly allowing it to be not only reset, but permanently cleared by the user gives us a framing to say, you know what, this is not a always personal identifier. Advertisers can have maybe some good controls, guarantee that it's not linked to personal information, and the fact that perhaps users can clear it and reset it and actually make it go away does, I think, something significant against the argument that this is a globally unique ID, a social security number for advertising that is permanent and that is on your device and can't be changed and is linked possibly to lots of personal information. Now consumers have a pretty good tool. I don't know that it's going to settle the argument by any means, but I think if you want to look big picture, Apple's done something that provides a privacy limit, which in the long term could help support the use of an identifier like this, especially if there are other limits and protections, and so that we can prevent it from being an explicitly personal identifier. So that's long-term, big picture, but at the Future of Privacy Forum, we try to look at the big picture for privacy and for ad tech and for consumers. Thanks for paying attention. We'll post in the comments the blog post we did discussing this change, and hope you find it interesting.